Hello friends, welcome to Drishti YouTube and welcome to our session on the Economy Simplified, where we discuss multiple topics in detail in short length but with all the relevant aspects and the MCQs. In this video we shall discuss the concept of GDP Deflator. Let's see what is this. Let's have a table here, right, to understand it better. See, GDP we know is about the monetary value of all the final goods and services produced in the country's territory in a given financial year. We know this is GDP. GDP is about, we measure whatever we have produced in the country in a single year. A given financial year is called the GDP. India, say, produces 330 lakh crores of the goods and services in a given year. The GDP includes the exports and excludes the imports because imports are not a part of India's production. So we measure GDP to understand what is the level of production a country makes in a given year, right? What is GDP deflator? You see, GDP is a monetary value which is again the price, or say we can say we measure the quantity of the produce in a given year and we multiply by the price of the product in that same year. So multiplying the price of a product into the quantity will give me a GDP. Assume that we produce the wheat, right, of 10 kgs and the price for the same year, suppose I talk of the year 2026-27, for this year production is 10 kgs and the price of the wheat was, say, 20 rupees per kg. The GDP becomes the rupees 200 and this is called the nominal GDP. This is the nominal GDP. A GDP at the current market price is called nominal GDP. Now you see, quantity is okay, but you see the prices may be higher due to inflation. In a given year, it is possible that the price will be very high due to inflation. And that is why we also measure a concept called the real GDP. The real GDP is the real value of the production. Suppose we keep the quantity same and we assume that the price of this wheat should not be rupees 20, it should be rupees, say, 10. And this rupee 10 is a price of a year, say 2022-23, where we see this is the optimum price and this year is called a base year, which is used as a reference year. In this year the price was alright and this year the price is highly inflated, and that is why we should take a GDP based upon this price. So GDP is rupees 100. And see, this GDP at rupees 100 is based upon a price which is a real price and hence it's called a real GDP. I hope you are clear that in a given year the prices may be highly inflated because of any reason, say pandemic, war, etc. So this price is inflated, so the GDP is nominal GDP. But suppose we believe that the price should be rupees 10 and this is the price of this year, so this is the base year and this is the GDP of the current year based upon the base year prices. So this is called the real GDP. For a given year 2026-27, you see the nominal GDP is rupees 200, the real GDP is rupees 100. Can I say that the prices or the GDP looks inflated, right? GDP should have been 100, it is showing as 200. So this is the GDP inflation, this is the GDP which is looking to be inflated, right? So this ratio, say 2, tells me the GDP which has been inflated. So suppose I reduce this GDP by this ratio, I get the real GDP. The other thing is GDP deflator. GDP deflator is the nominal GDP to the real GDP into 100. It's a number. It's a number which shows that how much percent the GDP is inflated, which should be deflated, right? In this case, the nominal GDP was 200, real was 100 into 100, 200 say percent. So I would say that the GDP was showing inflated by this ratio and this should be deflated, right? So that we get the real GDP, right? So suppose we want to measure the real GDP, we can use the GDP deflator, or we can suppose we want to measure the inflation, right? We can say that this GDP deflator tells me the level of inflation. Inflation is say twice or 200%, you see, which is true that the prices have increased by or say 2 times or say 200%. So you see whether this ratio or you see the GDP deflator, this GDP deflator can tell me the inflation in the economy between the two reference years, right? From the base year, how much prices have increased, I can get to know using the GDP deflator, right? So it's a measure, you can say it's a measure by which we can measure actually how much inflation is there in the economy in the current year as compared to the say base year. So GDP deflator is a ratio of the nominal to real GDP into 100, right? And this is a tool to understand the level of inflation in the economy. Let's have some questions on this. You see, we have seen in the previous discussions in other videos about inflation, right? Inflation we have seen is measured through the CPI and the WPI. Inflation that is measured at the consumer level is called consumer price index. So we measure inflation by the CPI at the consumer level, right? And we just saw the GDP deflator that also can help us to measure inflation, right? The question is about the two, that what differences the two have. Let's have a look. While both the GDP deflator and the CPI are used to measure inflation in the economy, they differ significantly in their methods. Which of the following statements accurately highlight a key distinction between the two? You see, as I said in the beginning of the discussion that GDP excludes imports and hence the GDP deflator will not have imports. This statement, the GDP deflator includes the price of imported goods, is incorrect because GDP itself excludes all the imports because GDP is about the production in the country. This is incorrect, right? Now, GDP deflator utilizes a fixed basket of goods. This is incorrect, friends, because GDP includes every production in the country which is measurable, right? It's not about a basket. It's the CPI which uses a basket of the goods and services to measure the inflation. So GDP deflator doesn't talk about any basket. It measures all the GDP, the nominal, the real, they divide and they get to know what is the price increase. So this is incorrect here, that the GDP deflator uses a basket of goods, right? The third statement is GDP deflator reflects the prices of all domestically produced goods and services, whereas the CPI reflects the prices of the representative basket of. Friends, this is true and correct because GDP is about all the goods and the CPI, the consumer price index, takes a basket of goods and services which is used to measure inflation. So this is a correct statement in this part and this is not correct, right? This is not, GDP deflator is not measured on a weekly basis, not by the Ministry of Labor. It's the GDP calculation by the NSO, right? So this is incorrect. This is incorrect. The answer here is C. See the next question. if an economy experiences a nominal growth of 12% in a financial year, while the real growth for the same is say 5%, what can we infer about the GDP deflator? You see, the GDP deflator is about nominal GDP to real GDP into 100, right? Now the nominal GDP is rising by 12% and the real by 5%. So let's see the statements. The price level has declined. This is incorrect because you see nominal GDP is rising faster than the real. It means inflation is there. Nominal GDP shows the GDP at the current market prices. So if that is at a faster rate than the real GDP, it means what? The prices are increasing, right? So this is not the correct statement. Now the GDP deflator has increased, indicating a rise of prices by approximately 7%. This is correct because the nominal has grown by 12%, real by 5% or say 7%. So what we see that the deflator is the inflation, which shows that the prices have increased by nearly 7%. This is a true statement, correct statement. The deflator is not constant. This is incorrect, and this is also not correct because we can measure. We can measure a approximate increase in prices because we know the concept of the deflator. We know the data on the nominal GDP, so we can say that the price increase is largely 7% because this is say 5%, this is say 12%. So approximately the growth rate, right, the inflation rate is also, you can say, is the nominal GDP growth rate minus the real GDP growth rate. So we can say inflation is nearly 7%. So this is the correct statement, B. The third statement is, suppose India experiences a massive surge in the global price of the crude oil, which it imports heavily to meet its domestic needs. Assuming all other domestic production prices remain entirely stable, how will this import price shock initially affect India's CPI and the GDPI deflator? You see, the first thing you have to see is the GDP doesn't include the imported goods. So if the price of the say oil increases, the GDP deflator will not take care of this change because we import the oil and the oil import is not a part of the GDP. So the first statement is both CPI and the GDP will be rising by the same proportion. This is incorrect because they both have different treatments of the imported crude oil, right? The GDP deflator will rise significantly while the CPI will remain unchanged. Friends, this is wrong because you see CPI includes the imported goods, GDP doesn't include. So GDP deflator will not change, CPI will change, right? The CPI will rise because oil directly affects consumer transport prices, and the GDP deflator will not change because this is not including the, this is a correct statement because GDP deflator doesn't include the imported goods, whereas the CPI does because CPI is about the prices change at the level of the consumers, and that's why, and both will not decline. So this is the incorrect was the answer. If you see that both will have a different treatment, CPI will increase because the oil prices have increased, GDP deflator will remain unchanged because, as I said, GDP doesn't include any imported items. So friends, this is all about the GDP deflator and the questions. We shall see other topics in the next video. Thank you.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.